One thing to note here is that focusing on the topic of population was very much a tactical choice in some ways. So that might be worth thinking about, maybe separately, because it's a kind of an accessible topic that everyone can maybe intuitively get. Oh yeah, development, ooh, population, okay. So for something that new students could kind of just drop into in the very first term, regardless of if they were a PhD student doing this as one of their compulsory modules for their first year of their PhD, or the many master students who joined it as a core module. You know, it's one that did need to reflect the actual makeup of the students themselves, right? So about 25 students in the room from a range of international backgrounds, numerous African students, European, British, and some East Asian and South Asian as well. Okay, so really from sort of, you know, that side of the world, not any from North or South America, but we're working on that for next year. And this means that there was also diversity of backgrounds, given they're all postgraduates. They all have come from rather interesting, you know, previous events in their life, such as running a business or working in NGOs, etc. Okay, let me move on. And another reason that this topic was chosen was because of this intersectionality that it kind of by default involves, and by which I don't just mean in the manner that, you know, we've reflected upon a lot recently, but how it intersects across elements of what we consider global development today, which, you know, under the 2030 agenda are the economic, social, and environmental, all needing to be there, at least present in some way. And the idea for this is then that by approaching it with this topic, we can kind of start playing around a bit with the idea of what disciplines are, and also how, you know, different participants in the room may bring different presumptions or presuppositions to the class. Okay, so moving on from context to content, I only had 4 hours to do all of this in, so of course it had to be pretty abridged, but I had some quite key priorities for how this was to go along. So the first class was what I termed, at least to myself, the mainstream one, where we looked at kind of what you might consider the standard sort of development, population dynamics, demographic transition, demographic dividend, youth bulge, all of these terms that we kind of see often cited quite uncritically, and with a lot of traction within the current global policy agenda, particularly at the more elite levels of it. But even so, despite the fact that I didn't really give the game away quite intentionally in this first class, students were already a bit kind of confused as to how sources that seemed, without necessarily knowing why, that seemed something was a bit off for them, still being very, you know, heavily received and worked with, you know, 1,000+ citation type articles. So the next week, I kind of then unveiled it a bit further, bearing in mind there were only 2 weeks to do this in. Then looked at populationism as sort of a strand of development thinking, but particularly through the, I guess, what I term the dual prismatic lens of gender and race as intersecting inequalities amongst numerous others, that can start critiquing how population debates, as they are framed and proliferated from the top, we could say, or by which I mean elite academia, as well as large policy organizations, universities as well, of course, and etc., governments, how these will be steeped in our own histories. And the idea then was that students would take these two, we could say, aspects of the debate, or perhaps, you know, two wings of an overall concept or topic, which is population, and start recombining them in diverse ways. To kind of help them along with this, bearing in mind it's a lot to ask for in, you know, just 2 weeks of sessions, I said these case studies on global aging, by which I mean, you know, across a range of potential global contexts. This term, the youth bulge, or the kind of, you know, increasing youth populations, which I think focused on Nigeria, and then childlessness in Northeastern Europe, by which I mean Estonia, Finland, etc. Right, so that kind of gave students this view that, you know, population is actually a very complex and wide-ranging topics, and in several ways is a bit of a proxy for development itself. You know, because we're considering or thinking or kind of dictating or prescribing how you know, human societies should or shouldn't proliferate. I'll get back to that, which is, you know, very similar, at least in some ways, to the whole idea of development as a global project, as a kind of, you know, common good, shared planet, etc. Okay, now within all of this context and content, I had my own contingent syllabus, which is kind of similar to the concept of the shadow curriculum, but I prefer this term because it's more openly post-structural. It's more kind of, it's less loaded sounding than there being a shadow thing, which seems a bit scary. But actually just some unexplicit aims for this, this teaching style that I used. Well, first of all, it was to, you know, really push into this idea that knowledge, particularly at the postgraduate level, you know, is encountered individually through reflection, through consideration and reconsideration of certain themes, certain assumptions that might exist, but also that is for those interested in doing so. That's because of the, as I said, the diversity of what we'd say early career scholars in the room, coming from quantitative or qualitative backgrounds, a range of different socioeconomic positionings, nationalities, religion, race, gender, etc. So it's very much that I invite students to join kind of the learning journey, but I also accept that it will be encountered at an individual level as well. The second aim here was to kind of start destabilizing what we might build up as, you know, global sustainable development, which is our degree title, but actually doing so through critical reflection and discussion that is still sensitive to diverse perspectives. By which I mean not presuming that decolonialism as a kind of aim, will occur amongst, you know, certain targets or not. Right. So for myself, as you know, the esteemed facilitator of the module, I didn't want to start imposing how students would encounter this this ranging debate, but did try and at least prompt a bit of critical thought, which can sometimes be a challenge, but that's another discussion. And then in line with that is to start thinking about this view of, you know, if we are talking about interdisciplinarity, that does involve at least two, but usually more disciplines that will have their own respective histories and their own, you could say, structural foundations as types of power or modalities for the use and exercise of power, right? The natural sciences kind of forwarding certain agendas, or the international development or global development sector also forwarding certain, more recently, quite neoliberal agendas. And in the same sense, academic disciplines also reflect, to some extent, this disciplining potential. Okay, I'm just checking time. Okay, got me paranoid with the timings. Very, very organized though. Okay, I also wanted students to explore the role of, you know, how dominant thought may not necessarily be hegemonic thought, but it may be the one that is the most prevalent and the most heavily pushed. I'm not convinced by the term hegemony completely, but I think it is fair to say that dominant thought will shape what is acceptable or not within discourse, by which I mean development discourse. And then the final here is that at the same time, you know, we do have a certain cohort of high achieving students who do want things to put on their resume or say in job interviews, which is an interesting kind of experience, you know, when you're focused on teaching critical studies or etc. But is worth, you know, kind of noting that that is also a priority amongst the students, and that by supporting students, you know, through the teaching and learning journey, there needs to be a bit of that as well, even if it's begrudgingly sometimes. Finally, I had this aim to inhabit a certain space that is neither mainstream nor critical, but perhaps a bit of both, or perhaps pushes or urges students to think about which way they may want to lean. And the idea for that was that there is a friction within interdisciplinarity. So it's not necessarily, going to bear these problems, but when you look at a topic such as population, it does. And that just highlights again that interdisciplinarity shouldn't be used offhand without this sometimes necessary added reflection. It's not necessarily going to reconcile within itself all these disciplines that you're kind of working across to advance a new idea or solution, or etc. It can, but regardless, every discipline that we inhabit within our academic lives will also have a certain history of its own, which is generally steeped in a range of inequalities. And finally, just this idea that students, undergrads as well as, I would say, postgraduate students, particularly when they start, will have a certain view of what academia is, and I think this ties in with a lot of unhealthy issues such as imposter syndrome and all that, but to actually start opening and democratizing that up a bit, whilst not pretending that they don't want to get good marks in their final assessments. Okay, so a couple of minutes left, that's fine. Now, just as we kind of talk about the reception and responses, remember that they're quite diverse as a group, okay? My slides are broken. I got caught up on the timing thing. That's okay. Bloody chat. I can't close the chat. But isn't Zoom like really 1990s? I kind of like it, but it's really 1990s, isn't it? I think the first thing is that there is this internalized belief across development studies, and that also exists within our own selves. There was a bit of an incredulity, which is good, going back to the, prompting incredulity aim of post-structuralism, that how there is a certain openness, and we could say increasing openness about reducing non-white human population, and just that kind of the way that sits there as under its own steam, kind of reproducing within discourse. No pun intended. There was also some uncertainty. So some students didn't really want to pick up the challenge, which is fine. It's a tough one, because I think you need to give enough for students to kind of grab onto and think about. But if it's really far away from what they use, from what they're doing or what their PhD is in, then that's okay too. But regardless of that, as long as you grapple with conception, what I've perhaps polemically put here, the reality that certain development knowledges will have a primary impact in how we view our future, view our fellow species mates, and how we think that we can manage and control this. So if that's all it really kind of got from students, then I'd be very happy with that. 1 minute left, I can conclude, no problem. I just wanted to finish, I guess, with these ideas. Okay, so it's great to be interdisciplinary. We, as the department, and myself as a teaching person within that department, I won't say pride ourselves on it, but we say it a lot. But it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you're interdisciplinary that everything coexists in a happy kind of syndrome. A lot can happen when you start looking at the fraughtness across disciplines, particularly in the teaching environment. And when we think about academia moving across disciplines, which is great, and useful in a lot of ways, by pretending that there's a win-win aspect to this, similar to how the SDGs portray themselves as win-win, it can start rendering this disservice to what I would prefer to consider work in progress, similar to decolonization, then perhaps an endless work in progress, but one nonetheless. And then just the idea of agency, that it always comes out and it can be unexpected. It can prompt agency in a range of ways, not necessarily positive or negative, but usually, I would say, hopefully relevant to critical thinking. I'm getting there. Okay, and then finally, I just wanted to reanimate some of the dissonances between certain disciplines and start to reassert, the importance of history and background and context, which, may lead to perhaps contingently down the line, more reflexivity on the idea of development academia as well. So thank you very much for my little whirlwind presentation. That's 4 minutes for questions.
We have a question in the chat from John. Do students get the importance and relevance of transdisciplinarity?
I don't really know. That's a very good question. I'm just trying to close the sharing. Hold on. Zoom is so weird today. It's not showing anything. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, I don't know if they do get it. I'm not sure if we get it as staff ourselves, right? I think there's so many different terms that are in use, multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary, or inter one. The inter one is kind of the most well-known one. For some reason, we've hitched our wagon to the transdisciplinary moniker. I mean, I think fundamentally, I don't really mind if students don't get it as long as they think about it. And as long as they think about what it means to kind of root your learning across a potential range of disciplines or perspectives, right? Different approaches to a problem. I didn't get into problem-based learning, but that's another priority and focus that we have within the department. Sometimes I think a bit too much, but you know, that's the way they were structured. So I think, yes, I think some of them get it. Some of them see it as a carte blanche to just, you know, throw any old source in their essays, such as Business Insider or whatever, which does happen. But I think a lot of students do actually grapple with it in in a somewhat emancipated way, because, you know, you're not having to restrict yourself to a certain article or journal or kind of whatever set of ideas. I would usually like to get students to think a bit more with development scholarship across, you know, a range of sources. But even so, you know, it does kind of enable some opening up of thinking and discussion in class as well. Just review the chat. Thank you. Yes, individual agency. I think there's a lot to be thought about in terms of subjectivity and agency in the, I guess, the learning environment. And how it can be, you know, we're doing a lot of work, and I say we as in, you know, academics, on inclusion and accessibility, which I think is really good. I'm keen to see what the next step after what we get, once we get the quick wins out of the way, such as, you know, enabling students with some certain learning differences to climb aboard. Yes, that's great, but then what's the next step beyond that in terms of inclusion? So I'm looking forward to that. I've got about 20-30 years of my career to get into that, I guess. So let's leave it at that for today, because I think we're out of time.